So I'm pretty surprised that I've never actually talked about Assassin's Creed before. I mean, there are so many games at this point, and while the gameplay and the mechanics of them vary, I think we can all agree that the story is the worst part of all of them, right? Like, we can all accept that as a fact, right? Well, apparently not, because every time that you start talking about the story, people start acting like the story issues are isolated to individual games. So people will bring up like Unity or Assassin's Creed 3 as being like particularly bad, but ultimately, I think the flaws of the story permeate the entire series, going back to the very first game. Like, I even like the first game, and I will admit that it has a lot of problems in terms of how it tells its story. And as I talk about all of this, you'll probably get a sense of why I dislike the story and why I think it's so bad, and how it kind of drags everything else down. But I want to preface this by saying that my critique might come off a little bit reductive, that I'm against complex storytelling, but that isn't the case. Okay, I love complex storytelling. I love multi-layered storytelling. But the thing is that the more complex a story becomes, the more work you have to do in order for the story to be consistent and coherent. Okay, as I've said multiple times in other videos, over and over again, the bigger the scope of your story, the bigger your problems are going to be while you're writing it. So, consider this a bit of an expansion of the Chekhov's gun principle, that everything in a story needs to be important to that story. Because I think we can all agree that there is a lot of waste in the story that underlines all of the Assassin's Creed games. Like, we have aliens, the end of the world, time travel, precursor civilizations, super technology, conspiracy theories, secret societies. Like, there's so much going on, and almost none of it fits together because all of it is based on a weird adaptation of a Slovenian novel that basically no one has read. And we can't really talk about Assassin's Creed without talking about this novel. So I guess we can call this part 1, the novel that Assassin's Creed is based around. So the whole thing begins in 1938 with a man named Vladimir Bartol, who is a Slovenian man who wrote a novel called Alamut. Now, as you can probably imagine, it is in fact about the famous assassins of the famous mountain. Because having been exposed to the story, he decided that, he just had to tell this story himself. He was also inspired by a very real assassination that occurred of a man named Alexander I of Serbia. Because as you can imagine, it's the 1930s, it's the Balkans, lots of assassination is going on. Anyway, what's the novel actually about? Well, the short answer is, it's complicated. Because writing at the time has a lot of bloat, and this story is no exception to that rule. I'm not going to give you a real in-depth review of the book, but if you're really interested, it was published in English in 2004, so you can go and check it out. I'm just going to run over like the Cliff Notes version to give you a sense of how the story progresses, because there's a lot of characters and a lot of actions and a lot of philosophy, and most of it isn't important to what we need to talk about today. So the basic story involves a man named Hassan-i Sabah, which is probably not how you pronounce that. He's the old man of the mountain, and he's decided that he's going to attack the Turks, and to do this, he's training an army at Alamut. So while we're there, we're introduced to the fact that the most loyal soldiers under Hassan's command believe, without a shadow of a doubt, that they'll go to heaven immediately if they die in the line of duty. And this creates a kind of zealotry which is unmatched by anyone else in the world. Except, it's then revealed that the reason that they believe this is based entirely on a lie. Because you see, at the top of the mountain, Hassan has constructed a garden, and through the use of drugs, lots and lots of drugs, he makes the soldiers believe that they've entered heaven itself. So essentially what he's done is convinced his soldiers that he's been given the power to send people to heaven at will for short periods of time through the use of heavy drugs. Now, suddenly, the Turks show up and they besiege the mountain. And Hassan tells his men to kill themselves for him. And one stabs themselves in the gut and the other throws himself off the mountain, because both of them believe that they'll go to heaven immediately for doing this. And seeing this, the Turks flee, the siege is broken, and Hassan tells the protagonist of the story to then go and kill a certain vizier. And the main character then goes and does so. However, upon doing so, the vizier tells our protagonist that Hassan is lying to everybody, and that everything is an illusion, and as you can probably imagine, this is very upsetting to our protagonist. Now, it's at this point that Hassan transitions into a full supervillain, because he then tells our protagonist's love interest that actually, our protagonist probably died in the attempt on the vizier, and said love interest then kills herself as a result. There's a lot of suicide in this story, because the willingness to die for lies is a theme. There's an entire other character that I haven't mentioned who also kills herself because she finds out that somebody else who I haven't mentioned doesn't love her. There's a lot of, extraneous characters and suicide in this story. Anyway, our protagonist, who is infuriated by all of these lies, returns to Alamut with the resolve to then kill Hassan. Except, upon returning, Hassan reveals his true motto, which is, nothing is an absolute reality, all is permitted. Now, upon hearing this, our protagonist cannot find it within himself to actually condemn Hassan, and so essentially just decides to leave, to wander about the world in contemplation, while Hassan himself seals himself in his tower, determined to just continue his work until he dies. Now, if you've played the first Assassin's Creed, you'll notice that they basically stole a bunch of the ideas from this book. So first, Hassan is the main villain. Second, the entire Creed is a lie. And third, the introduction scene where the assassins prove their dedication by throwing themselves off the battlements is adapted directly, albeit without any actual dying. But the core problem, I think, is their choice to adapt the Creed of Hassan almost directly. They choose to adapt it as nothing is true, everything is permitted. But the problem is that they adopt this in the exact opposite way that it's intended from the original work. Because in Alamut, the saying is a mark of Hassan's degeneracy. It's meant to be a mockery of faith itself, and the reasons why people will kill for it. Consider for a moment when this story was written. We're on the eve of World War II, and they've already gone through World War I. And not just that, the novel was humorously dedicated to Mussolini, because the author was very critical of uncritical faith in leaders. And so now we enter part 2. The assassins are idiots and are entirely hypocritical. Because the idea that the assassins, the supposed defenders of free will, are slavishly defended to a creed whose actual meaning is, if you believe in anything other than yourself, you're an idiot, is just rather strange. And throughout the series, they've tried very hard to explain the creed and make it make sense, but it simply will never make sense, because the very idea that nothing is true, and everything is thus allowed, means that the creed itself is not true, and that it's just not a great way to structure your idea of freedom. More than that, it reinforces their enemies' beliefs, because if nothing is true, that includes free will. Free will is a lie. And if it's a lie, then everything is permitted, because at the end of the day, nothing actually matters. It's an empty, meaningless statement as applied by the assassins in this series. It's a bit like if you took the saying of doctors, which is, first, do no harm, and applied this to the actions of a mass murderer. Like, it wouldn't make any sense, even if you're trying to deliberately invert the meaning to make some kind of point. So the basis of our story, like the basis of all of our characters, is already a contradiction. So how do you build a wider mythos off of such a shaky base? Well, in a word, poorly. Because let's zoom out from the Assassin's Creed itself and look at the wider conflict between them and the Templars, who are their primary antagonists. What do the Assassins, as an order, actually want? Primarily, it's to shape and control world events by killing the Templars, who want to shape and control world events. Now, the Assassins might talk a lot about free will, but in general, there's no actual difference between how they go about shaping world events and the way Templars shape world events, with one specific caveat. The Assassins do not want to use the various precursor artifacts that are littered throughout the world to do it. And yes, we are going to get to the precursor nonsense, but put that aside for now. Instead, accept that there are two groups, both of whom attain their goals through systemic murder, bribery, extortion, and corruption, and who both want to collect all of the Dragon Balls, but while the Templars want to use them to make all their wishes come true, the Assassins want to keep them in a hole somewhere. And that's really the main issue here, because the Templars ostensibly represent control, because they bang on about it all the damn time. But the Assassins, in reality, are no better, because if the Templars represent control by using magical weapons, what exactly do the Assassins represent by essentially believing that mankind is too stupid, ignorant, or evil to be allowed to have access to those same artifacts? So if you're being charitable, you could argue that the Assassins are removing the corrupting element of the precursor artifacts, that they are naturally seductive and evil things, but in practice, they come off more like helicopter parents that want to seal humanity in a playpen and put foam over everything because they're utterly convinced that humanity cannot exist without their constant stewardship. In essence, we have one group whose fundamental belief is that mankind is innately evil and thus requires their stewardship, and another group that believes that mankind is innately evil and thus requires their constant leadership. And if you can't tell which is which, it's because the writers can't either. And here's the thing, it's not just me saying that. They write all of this into the games themselves. Because by Assassin's Creed 3, the line between Templar and Assassin has been blurred so much that it's considered a twist when you discover that the first bit of Assassin's Creed 3 has you playing as one of the Templars. And in Rogue, you essentially discover that the difference between the Assassins and the Templars is nothing at all. It all depends on whether you want to use or hide the artifacts of ultimate power. And speaking of those artifacts, let's really delve into this plot point and how it works, because the various artifacts are, by their nature, not exactly bad as a story point. The idea that there are various objects which, over time, have shaped world events because their innate power is not on their own very world-breaking as an idea. So, like, in real life, we have stories about the Spear of Destiny, for example, and it's not a huge stretch to apply this to a fictional world. It's also not a huge stretch to say that these are artifacts of some lost civilization, with the reason being that none of the items are particularly complex as items. You have a cloak, a spear, an apple, a sword. They're pretty basic tools. Okay, it's not hard to imagine that these were somehow made from some strange metal that appeared on Earth at some point and doesn't exist anymore, or something to that effect. In other stories, usually this metal is created from, like, a meteor or some other thing from space. But the problem comes when you start bringing in what are essentially time-traveling aliens. Now we can get to part 3, the precursor nonsense. So there's two major issues with them. First, by making the story about these beings, everything that our human characters do, across time, becomes about them. Everything becomes about learning about them, seeing what they did, seeing what they left behind, seeing what happened to them, but we're not playing as them. So essentially, we're learning about beings who do not exist in the story proper. As an example, imagine for a moment if you sat down to watch Star Wars, but the entire movie wasn't about the actions of our characters as they live, but instead, the movies are now about characters learning, talking about, and wondering about characters who are long dead and who never actually appear themselves in the story. This would be incredibly boring and nonsensical. And in fact, it's so boring and nonsensical that in Assassin's Creed 3, they have to reveal that one of these beings is still around and alive, and that they're trying to shape events in the present. And then in Assassin's Creed 4, we learn that there's an entire cult dedicated around this individual. In some ways, this is the only path available to them, because remember how, when Ezio finally defeats the Pope, how his reward is to hear a message for Desmond, a person he'll never know. How his entire struggle and about all of his actions are shown to be meaningless because the story isn't actually about Ezio at all. It's about someone far in the future whose sole contribution to the plot is to be taking a nap for the entire series. Remember how utterly boring and deflating that was? Well, the only way to fix that problem is to make the previously passive precursors active participants in the story. They do this in two ways. One, as I already mentioned, with the individual acting as a third faction trying to influence events. The second is to play up how these precursors are literally the gods of antiquity, that they're not just in the form of the Egyptian and Greek pantheons, but they have the same names and that they directly interacted with humanity. Now this is stupid for a whole number of reasons, but let's take a step back and point out that, once again, humanity is a side character in its own story, because the real story, according to the games, is that of the precursors trying to figure out the future and stave off a destruction that has already occurred. Okay, and speaking of already happened, it's time to talk about the time travel aspect of the series. So I guess you could call this Part 4, Time Travel is Stupid. Let's start by saying that, in general, time travel is a terrible plot point, because it creates too many problems, and most writers are not capable of managing all of the various implications that introducing time travel involves. Okay? First, you have to explain the rules of time travel itself. So, for example, is this a situation where the butterfly effect is in full force? Or does nothing you try to do matter, to name the most obvious example of this? Does involving yourself create endless parallel timelines, or does it change a single timeline in many different ways? Is time something that always exists, or can you step outside of it and view it as an observer? And at this point, we haven't even touched on questions like free will or fated actions. For a series that constantly blathers on about free will, it can't even decide whether or not free will actually exists. Because if you can see the future, this implies that there is a future that can be seen. That this future implicitly already exists, and that things are moving towards it. That actions taken will in fact lead to this future that you can see. And beyond that, we have to ask if viewing the future changes it implicitly. We have to act if the very act of observation is in fact a step towards what is being seen. I must now bring up again my most important saying when I talk about stories, which is, the bigger the scope, the bigger your problems. But we are in fact getting a little bit off track. Because let's first point out that the stories cannot decide for themselves what path they want to take. So in the first game, it's implied that you're simply a passive witness to events that are unfolding. So much so that Desmond is entirely superfluous to the story. Like, he has no reason to exist in the viewing of Altair's story. There's no reason for the Animus to exist, except to act as an explanation for why you have a health bar or a map or quest markers, something which really didn't need explanations. In Ezio's trilogy, they expand this so that now we know that time works both ways. Desmond is looking back as other beings are looking forward. That everything that will be is set in stone and immutable, by virtue of the fact that Desmond can look back in the Animus and be told a message while viewing the world through Ezio, something Ezio obviously can't know. But then, in Assassin's Creed 3, Desmond actively hears what's going to happen, and the story decides to avoid its end-of-the-world plot with a deus ex machina, averting the world where Desmond becomes the leader of humanity after they return to the Stone Age, because the writers realized they couldn't make more games if that happened. See, if you removed all of the future stuff from the series, nothing in the past actually changes, because the future does not directly interact with the past. The characters in the future are passive witnesses to the events in the past, and the characters in the past have no idea that the people in the future even exist. And so all the future stuff does is take us, the viewer, out of the story. All the stuff in the future makes the world we're interacting in appear fake, because it is. So let me give you an example of this. When you're walking around Rome, or Constantinople, or Jerusalem, or New York, or Paris, or London, you might actually find yourself getting immersed. You might find yourself taking in the sights and the sounds of the place your character is in. You might look at the streets and the skyline and enjoy yourself as you move around inside of it, looking for things to do in the city that you're currently in. But then the game will do some weird futuristic visual glitch effect, or maybe it creates some kind of modern platforming challenge, or maybe you get voiceover from the future where they comment on what's happening in the past, or maybe they just straight up take you out of the levels so that the modern characters can all talk about how you need to get back into the Animus and play more of the game. In fact, one of the worst things about all of these games is that you'll be playing a story section. You'll be involving yourself in the actions of a character like Ezio or Altair or whoever else, and then the game will pull you out of it and make you listen to the inane banter and chatter of our modern characters as they talk about how cool the stuff in the past is. It's entirely pointless and counterintuitive, because you could remove all of it, and the games would be better for it. Because look, if you want to make a game that's set in modern day about assassins and Templars, then make that game. If you want to focus on the past, then focus on the past. Don't do both, because neither of them helps the other. But you know what? Despite everything that I've said, despite everything that I've already talked about, I still haven't talked about the worst part of these stories. The worst sin that pervades the entire franchise. A sin that pervades the games, the comics, even the novelizations. A sin in storytelling that goes so deep that it poisons the well of every single part of the story itself. So now we get into part 5. It has to do with the nature of the Templars and the precursors themselves. The through line through all the games and the media around Assassin's Creed, more than the Wristblade, more than the assassins themselves, more than anything else, is the idea that in every time and every place that there are Templars, and that they are always acting, that every single thing in history, every single major event, involves them in some way. The Crusades, Templars. The Viking expansion, Templars. The American Revolution, Templars. The French Revolution, Templars. The Industrial Revolution, Templars. Colonialism, Ottoman expansion, the Greco-Persian Wars, the Roman Civil Wars, the conquest of India by the British, the rise of Imperial Japan, the rise of Thomas Edison and the ridicule of Tesla, all Templars. Everything that has ever happened in the world, every major event, every single action across the entire planet, no matter what time period, is because of the Templars, or one of their previous incarnations, such as the Cult of Cosmos or the Order of the Ancients. Here's the thing, for all of you aspiring writers. Not every bad thing that occurs in your world has to be because of the main villain. Not every event and every place has to somehow have a connection to the big bad guy. The big bad evil guy does not have to be managing literally every single plot that has ever occurred in your world, going back to when humanity crawled out of the primordial soup. Because not only is this extremely reductive, it beggars belief. Okay, in the first Assassin's Creed, this is all explained by the fact that the old man in the mountain, who has Altair kill all of his co-conspirators, is manipulating them all from the shadows, that they were originally a group not affiliated with either the Christians or the Muslims. Not really. Instead, they were trying to exploit the situation by placing themselves into positions of power that gave them maximum leverage. They might have called themselves Templars, but they held themselves as distinct from the religious affiliation that we normally give the group, because the Order was merely using the iconography as a tool to fool everybody else. Now this starts to fail when you start expanding it to all places and all time periods. The worst example, I think, is how we're supposed to believe that somehow people across all nations, all races, all cultures, and all languages are all somehow part of the same group, that there is no infighting among them, that the Templars of Britain and the Templars of, say, China or India have the same ideas and beliefs, that the members of these orders do not possess any kind of intrinsic bigotries, such as racism or sexism. In the most charitable of interpretations, we're led to believe that a British Templar and an Indian Templar both desire the subjugation of India under British rule, and that both of them see each other as equal, something that is so stupid on its face that it comes off as a farce. A less charitable take is that the British Templars are manipulating the Indian Templars, who can't possibly want to resist the glory and wonder of the British Templars and their civilization. If we went by that formulation, then the Indian Templars would intentionally loathe their own culture and wish to create a monoculture based entirely around whatever European Templars want, which is so problematic and racist that it beggars belief. And you could say that such a formulation is entirely uncharitable, that you shouldn't look to things that aren't presented in the games to understand the ideas of the story. Okay, let's talk about the slave trade, shall we? Because in Assassin's Creed 3, 4, and Liberation, the slave trade is explicitly pointed out as being a Templar plot, with varying reasons given. Okay, in 4 and Liberation, the core reason given by various Templars is that slavery is deliberately a way of civilizing black people, because they need the Templars to give them the understanding that comes with their wisdom. That's not subtext, okay? That's just the text as it is presented to us. In other words, the story is trying to tie itself to the idea that the Templars are behind such things as white supremacy and racism. Okay, you can go that direction. But you can't, however, go that direction and also go to the direction that the Templars are present in these societies and are actively working to exploit their own people. Okay, you cannot write a story wherein the Templars are both the British selling the Chinese opium and the Chinese buying the opium to weaken their own country in the name of Templar dominance, when you are also at the same time writing that the Templars are also a force behind the Ming Dynasty's repression of the people. You cannot write a story where literally every faction and every entity is a Templar plot. But let's step back from racism for a second and give a European example, in case you aren't convinced by this structuring of the issue. Okay, let's talk about Assassin's Creed Unity. Okay, in Unity, the Templars are behind the oppression caused by the monarchy. Alright, they're also behind the terror committed by the Jacobins like Robespierre. And they're also behind Napoleon. In other words, they are constantly working against themselves because the writers are trying to tie them to literally every bad thing that has ever happened at every point in time. In essence, the Templars are both the Vikings that invade Britain, and they're also the native Anglo-Saxons who are being invaded. They are both the pagans and the Christians. They are both the American revolutionaries and the British Redcoats. And at no point do we ever see any splintering of the Templars or any infighting between Templar groups who think that they have their own ideas about what enlightenment means, because this would go against the very idea that the Templars are also a monolith responsible for every bad thing that has ever happened to humanity. Okay. Now we have to ask a question, which is, why do the Templars need to be a monolith? And the reason, you may be surprised to know, is not because they always need to be in the wrong. Because as we see in Assassin's Creed 3, Rogue, and Black Flag, the assassins can very easily be the stupidest people alive and actively end up harming their own cause. Which may as well be part 6, I guess. The reasons for all of this. The reason is that the assassins, at every point, must be weak. They must always be on the back foot. They must always be removed from power, so that they themselves do not bear any responsibility for anything that happens. Okay, some may chalk this up to the demands of the games. So, for example, in Assassin's Creed 3, you have to rebuild the global assassin order, something which you had to also do in Brotherhood and Revelations. One could theoretically understand this when we're talking about centuries. But the time between, say, Unity and Syndicate isn't that long, nor is the time between Assassin's Creed 3 and Unity. Meaning that the assassins are rebuilt in 3, collapse before Unity, are then rebuilt again to be strong in France but not in England for Syndicate, and then swiftly collapse again when the plot demands it. You could, essentially, chalk this all up again to the fact that gameplay needs this to happen, that the idea of building up a worldwide network from nothing is fun, and so we just need to consistently and constantly have the assassins be utterly incompetent to make this so, while also justifying our idea that the Templars are a monolith that cannot be stopped. But I personally think that the problem is actually more problematic than that when we're talking about stories. Because the issue is that the assassins must always be innocent of intentional wrongdoing when they are the ones that we are supposed to be controlling, even if this makes them out to be complete morons in the process. Okay? The assassins are behind all of humanity's supposedly good people. Guys like Leonardo da Vinci, for example. They are behind guys like Connor, who just want to do the right thing. But the problem is that this formulation means that they are essentially powerless and blameless when plot events happen. Connor, for example, supports the revolution, but then finds out that his own people are being slaughtered by Washington, despite having also killed the man who was trying to stop them from dying in the first place, because he was a Templar. Okay? In Unity, our protagonist has to be entirely absent for the major events of the revolution. We skip from the beginning of it to the end of the Terror, when Robespierre is already crazy, meaning that his desire for revolution is in no way responsible for all the chaos he then unleashes. Now, sure, Ezio empowered the Medici family, who have literally bought popes and were some of the most corrupt individuals at the time not named Borgia, but they couldn't have known that putting themselves in power would cause them to end up being bad people, right? We're left feeling like our protagonists aren't so much freedom fighters and visionaries with strong-held beliefs about the nature of freedom, and more like that they're children or animals who can't be blamed for the consequences of their actions because they simply don't know any better. Remember earlier when I said that the assassins often feel like parents trying to keep humanity in a playpen, like humanity is made up of children? They're exactly the same. In fact, the only way that the story can justify the assassins is by having the Templars be cartoonishly evil and tied to literally every bad thing that has ever happened since Cain killed Abel. Okay, if the Templars aren't illogically and irrationally sinister, then the assassins come off as inconsistent lunatics who literally can't formulate a coherent idea of what they actually want. Because sure, they want freedom, but when anyone else makes a choice that they don't like, they're perfectly happy to stab that person in the face. It just so happens that the plot says that all of these people that they don't like are also involved in a global conspiracy to create a one-world government based around a bunch of time-traveling aliens with magic Dragon Ball weapons. And that brings us to part the end, conclusions. Because I feel like at this point, I feel like I'm at the stage where further critique would just kind of be repeating myself. I feel like I've drilled down so far to get to the core that bringing up other issues seems almost pointless. Because, yeah, I could talk about how, like, having our protagonists meet famous people in history rather than just being those famous people in history means that, once again, our protagonists are absolved from anything those people actually did. And What this means is that it turns out our protagonists are just all wide-eyed cheerleaders for various historical figures. But really, that's kind of mundane compared to everything else I've explained. It's hard not to get the idea that the writers simply don't know what to do with their own series or where to go with it, and so they've intentionally created a dynamic where more content can be produced without that content actually having to make sense in any sort of wider context. So for example, if we took Assassin's Creed 3 and removed it from all of the other games, it is internally consistent, for the most part. Our protagonist is still a moron, but we could at least get a grasp on the forces that are at play and the sides that they represent. And at the same time, if we took something like, say, Odyssey on its own, separate from the rest of the series, it's still internally consistent. There's very little within itself that contradicts its own idea of what continuity actually is. And if we could take every game as a standalone, if we took every game to have its own canon, its own timeline, then we might be able to excuse many of the problems that I've brought up. But the problem is, you can't do this, because the series relies on the amount of games that actually exist to give itself legitimacy. Okay, each time a new Assassin's Creed comes out, the story's weight relies on the idea that the other games were consequential, that each game had a story that made a difference in the wider world that the games take place in. The problem is that the differences result in endpoints that are entirely divorced from the starting points of other games. So for example, if you tried to plot out the sequences of events on a timeline, you'd probably find that you had gaps between them as you tried to explain how the ending of one game somehow resulted in the starting point for another. It is, simply put, an incoherent mess. And it's a real shame because the underlying mechanics and gameplay are, for the most part, completely solid. Like, I enjoy Assassin's Creed in terms of gameplay, even the ones that other people say aren't that good. Like, I actually had fun with Unity for the time that I played it. I enjoyed exploring London and Syndicate. I enjoyed the power trip of Odyssey, and I enjoyed the violence of Valhalla. Okay, I enjoyed exploring the Holy Land in the first game when I originally played it, and I enjoyed, exploring various cities in Assassin's Creed with Ezio. I put countless hours into these games, and even I was one of those weirdos who actually enjoyed collecting various beer bottles in Syndicate just to see what they would come up with. I enjoyed playing Origins and exploring the various tombs and temples. I even enjoyed loot grinding in Odyssey for a time. It's just a shame that the series goes out of its way to make its story such an albatross for the world it wants to create. Every time the games create an interesting set piece or idea, the story rears its head and drags you back out of it. There's no reason to assume that this is ever going to change either, because much how movies like The Fast and the Furious persist despite being objectively terrible and rehashes of previous movies, or how Marvel movies can recycle otherwise bland ideas and still make billions, Assassin's Creed is a big enough franchise that it will persist simply because there is a base that is still good enough to warrant it. That the stories, as awful as they are, do not change, that the underlying gameplay loops are often fun and engaging, and that we enjoy going back and wandering around the worlds that we can see. It's just a shame that the stories absolutely stink